Welcome to another episode of the Reloop Brief. I'm Barry Snedden, the Director of Communications here at Reloop. And in this episode, Shraddha Kumar speaks with Rob Kelman, the Director of Reloop Pacific, about the ongoing campaign which is calling for container refund values to increase from 10 cents to 20 cents. And it's a timely conversation. Australia now has container deposit coverage across all states and territories, and early results from Tasmania, the latest state to join Australia's deposit return landscape, shows just how quickly these systems can make a difference, with beverage litter reportedly dropping by 50% in the first year of the state's Recycle Rewards scheme.
We're talking about this interesting time for Australia. Earlier this year, there was a campaign that began with the coalition of environmentalists and industry experts, as well as community groups, called the 20 Cents Make Sense campaign. And we're going to ask Rob more about it, but let's pivot a little and talk about why this is such a crucial time to be talking about increasing deposits in Australia. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So, going back into why this is such a pivotal moment to be talking about recycling and why it's important to increase recycling and why deposits matter in this regard, could you walk us through what is going on right now in Australia that's getting this coalition to demand higher deposit amounts?
Yeah, so the term circular economy is not just a name, but it's a notion of kind of modern manufacturing, and the recovery and reuse of materials for manufacturing. Yeah. What we're seeing, obviously, with sort of global disruptions of oil and plastics out of the Middle East issues, is that there is a constraint on the supply of the virgin material that normally goes back into packaging and other things. Obviously, there's restraints on oil more broadly for fuel. And the notion that you can, instead of dumping all of this material that we use once in the form of packaging, whether it's beverage containers or whether it's food packaging or other plastics and metals, etc., the notion is that you can recover that material rather than using virgin material. Now, at the moment, the vast majority of plastics, about 90+% in Australia from packaging, goes into landfill or into the environment. So I think for the first time I saw a recognition from the federal government in Australia that this wasn't just an sort of environmental good news story to recover more of that material, again, whether it's beverage packaging or film or other rigid plastics, but it actually had meaning for processors in Australia and producers of packaging in Australia. And it was interesting that idea of economic resilience had sort of at last kind of had purchase, and that there was a ministers meeting a couple of weeks ago beyond the environment minister into industry and manufacturing ministers, etc., around that notion. So I think that's interesting, not just for beverage containers, but also there's a long and arduous conversation going on in Australia about a packaging EPR scheme that could recover a lot more than the sort of 6 or 10% of plastic packaging that's currently put on market.
And we know from global data that it does have an impact on the amount of items collected for recycling when we have higher deposits, because that incentivizes better returns. This time there is a push coming from both industry and local community groups. Could you talk us through why that is?
Yeah, I'm going to couple this up again with the broader conversation around packaging, because I think the two are intertwined. There's a demand in Australia for reform broadly. Now, we have an existing deposit return scheme, which is extremely low performing by global standards. It's been successful. It's doubled the quantity of beverage packaging coming back for recycling, and it's massively reduced the amount of that material in the litter stream. And so there's good news stories there, but we sit at 68% median return rate, while, our brethren in Europe are at 99%. I think Finland's at 90. I mean, it's absurd how much improvement could be made on the Australian approach, going from 10 cents to a more meaningful refund value. Conversation is about 20 cents, but ultimately it could be higher, and it would need to be pegged to the consumer price index and inflation, so that we didn't have to keep prosecuting the same argument over and over again every 5 or 10 years. It's very difficult to change that. There's a sort of an incumbency issue there that, as I say, it's hard to shift. I mean, so that is a critical reform that this particular alliance is looking for. But equally, many of the companies involved in this grouping are also involved in other material and plastics processing for packaging. And, as I said, we have very, very low return rates for film and other rigid packaging in Australia. So, there's a bit of a cry for reform more broadly around packaging, so that we can sort of start to catch up to Europe a little bit.
I would, in fact, go so far as to say, of course, Europe is a shining example, but places where there's still a struggle to get better EPR programs and bottle bills, as they're called in the US, off the ground, there is data to support that even among the very few states that do have a deposit system, the ones that have the higher deposit do end up seeing, at the very least, a more massive reduction in littered bottles. And I'm thinking about states like Oregon and Michigan in this regard. So, at its very core, increasing the deposit amount is a small step to a big change. And I'm hoping that that picks up in Australia. And I know that New Zealand and Australia are right now in very different places in terms of their EPR, and how is it playing differently in New Zealand than it does in Australia right now?
Yeah, well, we don't have a political commitment yet to introducing a DRS in New Zealand, and it's something that we're working with New Zealand colleagues on, and lead up to their November election this year. The conversation has always been it would be introduced with a 20-cent refund. I mean, obviously, some beverage manufacturers have tried to sort of reorient that to a lower fee aligned with Australia, but I don't think that that's really resonated that strongly. So it's sort of, there's a couple of hurdles. We have to get that political commitment first, and then the sort of conversation emerges around a sort of scheme design issues and the refund value. But I mean, I think, as I said, all the modelling has sort of been done around, a 20-cent refund to sort of kick off.
And lastly, what is the one message you would like to leave our audience with about why this reform is so important and why it matters so much right now?
We're seeing return rates in Australia stagnate. Now, generally, you want to keep improving things, and we don't have the ability to massively improve the collection network because we don't have a retail return obligation, which we are expecting should be applied in the New Zealand market. So what are the triggers that are available to ministers? Increasing the refund value is kind of it. So if ministers are happy to see the schemes continue to dilute, then they won't do anything. If they expect these schemes to maintain parity with existing recovery rates, and indeed improve, increasing the refund value is kind of the go-to mechanism.
Shraddha Kumar speaking with Rob Kelman about the campaign to increase deposit value on beverage containers in Australia as a case for strengthening container deposit schemes nationwide. And of course, we'll continue to follow developments in Australia and New Zealand as the debate around deposit return, packaging reform and circular economy moves forward. And if you want to listen to more episodes of the Reloop Brief, check out reloopplatform.org.